When we say nature, we picture wilderness, but today nature often looks very different. With tools like CRISPR, we can now edit genes in animals, plants, even wild populations. What does it mean for ecosystem and for us? And are we solving problems or creating new ones we don't fully understand? Welcome to today's episode of The Green Wire, podcast by the Center for Environmental and Technology Ethics Prague. And our guest today is Dr. Rosine Kelz, Marie Curie researcher at the Center for Environmental and Technology Ethics Prague. Welcome and thank you very much for being with us.
Thank you for having me.
Could you, for start, explain us or introduce us your project?
Yeah, so for my Marie Curie Fellowship, I'm researching how nature conservation at the moment discusses about the use of new biotechnologies. And this is a topic now because nature is changing so much with climate change and other pressures, so that a lot of nature conservationists think they have to adopt new techniques or strategies.
So when we say nature, what do you think nature is?
That really depends on the context. I think, like for us, nature can be really the park around the corner, but it also, for nature conservation, more importantly, is places where natural processes can unfold without our intervention and where non-human species have the ability to live that don't do so well with our close proximity. So.
Can we also explain the term non-human species? What do you mean by that?
Oh, I said this to include everything from animals to plants, like everything that is not human and also lives, right? So that's what nature conservation is mainly concerned with.
Do we really need to return ecosystems to the past, or is something that it's not realistic?
So I think it's less and less realistic. Nature conservation formed kind of as a response to industrialization, and so many nature conservationists try to maintain or restore ecosystems to a pre-industrial state. But the pressures we see now, especially with climate change, are so strong that this becomes less and less possible.
And why is not possible? Because of the climate change?
Yeah, so the ecological conditions change, and also in the last hundreds of years, species were moved a lot by humans. Like when we move around the world, we take species with us. And with climate change now, because it gets hotter and drier in some places and wetter in others, species by themselves start to move. Mainly polewards and upwards.
One powerful tool we now have is also a CRISPR. Could you explain what does that mean? How does it work?
CRISPR is a term for a new, or relatively new, it's since about 10-15 years, gene modification tool that allows to make cuts in DNA strands. And in this way, one can change DNA in a cell.
Is it fair to say that it works like genetic scissors? Or it's too simply?
Yeah, of course. I mean, it simplifies it. What happens in a cell is quite a complex process. Like the CRISPR tool makes a cut and then the cell starts a repairing process, and that actually introduces the change in the cell. But I think it's shows that it's about cutting something in the DNA, which older tools did not necessarily do.
Rosine, can you tell me what makes it different from all the genetic engineering?
Older genetic engineering usually introduced a piece of DNA from another organism within a cell, and then this piece of DNA would integrate somewhere in the DNA strand. But the scientists couldn't really kind of lead it to a specific location. With CRISPR, they can target a specific location in the DNA, more or less.
Should we be worried about consequences of using CRISPR methods?
I think in a certain sense, but it's not so much about the method as such, because it is much faster and cheaper than earlier methods. It allows for genetic modification to be done in a lot more species and more quickly by more researchers, by more teams all over the world. And so we will see changes much quicker. So society doesn't have time to discuss what they actually want to be done in gene modification and which other things we maybe do not want.
And why is that problem we need to discuss all these changes?
Well, because these are changes that have like very long-term consequences, right? They can change evolutionary processes in plants and animals. Also, if they are used in medicine, they could change evolutionary processes in humans. And so it has very long-term consequences, and therefore we have to discuss what we actually want this technology to do and what not.
So we can actually predict that these genetical changes will due to a whole ecosystem, or are we just guessing now?
It depends what plants or what animals you do this with and for what purposes, right? But as soon as you bring something out into the ecosystem, there is the possibility, yes.
And Rosine, could you give me one good example of using CRISPR and let's say one bad example of using CRISPR methods?
For me, it's about that we really discuss what we want to be done in biomedicine, in agriculture, and maybe even in nature conservation, even though I would really think nature conservation is a special case and that there are other questions about actually using biotechnologies come up. But even with agriculture, I think it really depends on discussing with everybody involved, and that means a really broad societal discussion what we want agriculture to be like.
But do we have really time to discuss all these changes because of the climate change?
Yeah, I think the idea that CRISPR and other genetic modification tools are an answer to climate change might not really hold what it promises. I think, yes, we have to address climate change, but that means mainly trying to mitigate climate change and not trying to find a technological fix how we change plants to respond better to climatic situations in the future.
And who should be the authority who decides what's good and what's not?
I think in the end that really means that discussions about which kind of scientific projects we conduct as societies have to be under stronger democratic decision making. So at the moment, people usually only hear about this kind of when things are already like entering the market. I think there have to be a lot of different ways of earlier involvement of the public, where we discuss broader what we actually want technology to do. That also has to do with science communication and education. So I think nowadays often the public doesn't really know how certain new technologies work and what the risks associated with them could be. So yeah, I think that's the main part, is that we don't think it's like a necessary development just because something becomes maybe possible, but really thinking where do we actually want to go.
So are we solving farming problems or just making industrial farming bigger and more intense?
Yeah, I think that's the main discussion with genetic modification. That was already the discussion with the first generation, and it's now again, like, do we actually want to have more sustainable ways of doing agriculture, or do we try to find technological solutions for issues that are often produced by industrial agriculture to maintain these systems? So I think this is something which the technology like CRISPR cannot be discussed apart from these broader discussions about what should agricultural systems look like to be just to humans and to the non-humans involved in these systems.
So most gene editing happens in animals, not humans. Why is that easier for society to accept?
Well, actually, most gene editing happens in plants, and so we don't really think about that much. And when it's about animals, I think we usually are not that aware of it. Like, most gene editing in animals is done for biomedical research. And I think that is kind of below the discussion that we have. Like, we have discussions about maybe some people about if we should use animals for biomedical research at all, but then we don't really focus on the specific issues of genetic modification. But this only becomes like an ethical issue that we discuss when it is about genetically modifying humans. So I think, yeah, we should discuss more maybe earlier. What does it mean to genetically modify animals for biomedical research? Are there different ethical issues that come up than with other forms of using animals in laboratories? So yeah, I think it's just not that visible, and that's why we don't really talk about it that much.
When we call animals like models, do we forget they are living beings?
Yeah, I would say so. I mean, that's part of the system of using animals in laboratories, is that as a model, they become a tool, they become an object of scientific investigation, and this kind of removes us from them as living beings, right? Yeah.
And we also believe that is for good reasons, right?
Yeah, and I mean, it has benefited research in the past, especially basic research in genetics, really depended on model animals.
According to you, is it ethical to create animals that are meant to get sick for research?
Well, I wouldn't say it's ethical. I mean, I think there are reasons why we do this, but we should really think hard about if there are other ways to do research like this.
And do we have other ways?
Again, I'm not an expert
yes.
on this. I know that there are quite a few people who say that we do not really need animal models that much anymore. And with every case, we should really think about, can this research be done in a different way? One reason why some people are very skeptical about this, because there are still big differences between humans and laboratory mice, or even humans and other species of monkeys, right? So that is one point. And then also, like, the conditions of animals living in laboratories is quite specific. So very often we find that in the very end, a lot of this research is not really usable for final medical research on humans.
So are we turning animals into tools instead treating them as lives that matters?
Yeah, I think so. We do that in biomedical research. We do this also in agriculture. I think that's just actually a big part of our current culture, that we use animals for all kinds of purposes that have nothing to do with their well-being. Yeah.
In your research, you sometimes use the phrase apocalyptic word. What do you mean by that?
So actually what I was talking about there is that there's a shift in how a lot of people think about the changes in nature and environment more broadly. So in earlier environmental activism, there was often used this idea of a coming apocalypse that we need to stop in some way. And so activism really tried to prevent a future from coming that is not yet there. And in current activism and discourses, you see a change, that we actually very often talk about a post-apocalyptic situation, where we see that a lot of environmental destruction has already happened, that a lot of catastrophes have happened in the past. And so we live in this ongoing sense of an unfolding catastrophe. And that kind of changes how we think about how we act politically in these times.
Could you be more concrete how it does change?
Well, there are different ways. I think for some people it's really this idea that, okay, there is no possibility to prevent climate change. That means we have to see how to prevent the worst case, while at the same time already finding ways to live within these more catastrophic situations. That means also paying more attention to how environmental destruction already in the past has unfolded and has made some humans and non-humans more vulnerable than others. And so it's kind of shifts the focus to issues of justice, not so much in preventing futures, but in making the past, the present more livable for everybody.
For many communities, collapse already happened. How should that change how we talk about climate change and conservation?
So I think this idea of that collapse or catastrophes have already happened in the past also allows us to think about, ideas of how can we live more justly in the present? How can we try to overcome the issues that are there together and live better in a present that is not perfect? It allows us to see how past injustices have formed ecologies, have formed social communities, and then see how we can kind of engage with these past injustices to make the present and future more livable for everybody in a way.
How should this future look like?
So to be honest, I'm not that big of an optimist.
Okay.
So, yeah, I mean, ideally it would be like we have to come to terms with that climate change and a lot of other ways of ecological destruction cannot be rolled back. Like the world in the future will look much different. But we really have to think like how can we deal with this in a way that is allows a better life for as many life forms as possible. For me, that really means that humans have to stop putting themselves in the center in a lot of ways. Like we have to allow wild animals and wild plants to survive in this world as much as we can. But it also really means that on a global scale, we have to think about social justice and redistribution of goods so that those people who are already and will in the future be most strongly affected by climate change and other environmental catastrophes that are like humanly made and that like some people profited from in the past and in the present are enabled to live with this as good as possible, even though we cannot prevent a lot of catastrophes there.
And do we rely too much on technology to fix everything?
Yeah, I think so. I think that a lot of talk about technologies that may in the future actually help to prevent some outcomes of climate change to come to pass actually work as a way of like kind of taking the focus from what we have to do in the present, like political actions, which is changes in economic systems we have to do now. So the way we discuss about technology often makes it seem as if we could keep the current socio-political and economic systems globally in place unchanged and just need new technology. And I think that's just not true. That's
that's not true.
Yeah, that's just kind of like changing the conversation to not talk about the maybe much harder things we would have to do at the moment to prevent climate catastrophe in the future to become even worse.
And why do you think that policymakers and other decision makers are not willing to talk about climate change or just try to do something? Because we can see here in Czech Republic that we are not asking questions about climate change and something like that. So what's the reason according to you?
I think the reason is that it really means changing economic systems, and that's hard to do. That's something that people who at the moment benefit from economic systems have very little interest in doing. That's the main point.
What would a more humble relationship with nature look like?
For me, a more humble relationship to nature really means giving other species the space they need to also have a good life. It means that we should give up this idea that we can control nature as a whole and also in small bits and see that actually more life can unfold in better ways if we let it, like just step back actually, yeah.
If you could give policymakers one simple piece of advice, what would it be?
Well, we have to stop carbon emissions. I think that's quite clear. And so you have to do everything for that, yeah.
Okay, and the last question. Are you more worried or hopeful about the future?
Well, I'm not a very optimistic person, so I think that's unfortunately also how I see the future. I'm not really seeing things, especially with climate change, but also biodiversity loss getting better in the near future. The far away future, who knows, right? Things might be very different. The one thing that makes me kind of hopeful is that I think what happens in the future is always a surprise. Like, I think that usually we have a much too deterministic idea about the future. We think a certain technology is there, so it will be used in this way. We think that things are like set in certain ways, and then surprising things happen. So my hope is that surprising things will happen. But if I just look at the data at the moment about climate change, about biodiversity, I'm pretty pessimistic, yeah.
So it's not so pessimistic in the end. Rosine Kelz were our guest. Thank you very much for being with us.
Thank you.